"It's the one Miss Angorian set for last week's homework," said the other boy. "I remember wind and finned. It's about submarines." While Sophie and Michael blinked at this new theory, wondering how they had missed it, Neil exclaimed, "Hey, it's my long-lost homework. Where did you find it? Was that funny writing that turned up yours? Miss Angorian said it was interesting, lucky for me, and she took it home with her." "Thank you," said Howl. "Where does she live?" "That flat over Mrs. Phillips' tea shop, Cardiff Road," said Neil. "When will you give me the new tape?" "When you remember how the rest of the poem goes," said Howl. "That's not fair," said Neil. "I can't even remember the bit that was written down now. That's just playing with a person's feelings." He stopped when Howl laughed, felt in one baggy pocket, and handed him a flat packet. "Thanks," Neil said devoutly, and without more ado he whirled round to his magic boxes. Howl planted the bundle of roots back in the wall, grinning, and beckoned Michael and Sophie out of the room. Both boys began a flurry of mysterious activity, into which Mary somehow squeezed herself, watching with her thumb in her mouth. Howl hurried away to the pink and green stairs, but Michael and Sophie both hung about near the door of the room, wondering what the whole thing was about. Inside, Neil was reading aloud. "You are in an enchanted castle with 4 doors. Each opens on a different dimension. In Dimension 1, the castle is moving constantly and may arrive at a hazard at any time." Sophie wondered at the familiarity of this as she hobbled to the stairs. She found Michael standing halfway down, looking embarrassed. Howl was at the foot of the stairs having an argument with his sister. "What do you mean? You've sold all my books," she heard Howl saying. "I needed one of them particularly. They weren't yours to sell." "Don't keep interrupting," Megan answered in a low, ferocious voice. "Listen now. I've told you before. I'm not a storehouse for your property. You're a disgrace to me and Gareth, lounging about in those clothes instead of buying a proper suit and looking respectable for once, taking up with riffraff and layabouts, bringing them to this house. Are you trying to bring me down to your level? You had all that education and you don't even get a decent job. You just hang around, wasting all that time at college, wasting all those sacrifices other people made, wasting your money." Megan would have been a match for Mrs. Fairfax. Her voice went on and on. Sophie began to understand how Howl had acquired the habit of slithering out. Megan was the kind of person who made you want to back quietly out of the nearest door. Unfortunately, Howl was backed up against the stairs, and Sophie and Michael were bottled up behind him. "Never doing an honest day's work, never getting a job I could be proud of, bringing shame on me and Gareth, coming here and spoiling Mary rotten." Megan ground on remorselessly. Sophie pushed Michael aside and stumped downstairs, looking as stately as she could manage. "Come, Howl," she said grandly. "We really must be on our way. While we stand here, money is ticking away, and your servants are probably selling the gold plate. So nice to meet you," she said to Megan as she arrived at the foot of the stairs. "But we must rush. Howl is such a busy man." Megan gulped a bit and stared at Sophie. Sophie gave her a stately nod and pushed Howl toward the wavy glass front door. Michael's face was bright red. Sophie saw that because Howl turned back to ask Megan, "Is my old car still in the shed, or have you sold that too?" "You've got the only set of keys," Megan answered dourly. That seemed to be the only goodbye. The front door slammed, and Howl took them to a square white building at the end of the flat black road. Howl did not say anything about Megan. He said, as he unlocked a wide door in the building, "I suppose the fierce English teacher is bound to have a copy of that book." Sophie wished to forget the next bit. They rode in a carriage without horses that went at a terrifying speed, smelling and growling and shaking as it tore down some of the steepest roads Sophie had ever seen, roads so steep that she wondered why the houses lining them did not slide into a heap at the bottom. She shut her eyes and clung to some of the pieces that had torn off the seats, and simply hoped it would be over soon. Luckily it was. They arrived in a flatter road with houses crammed in on both sides, beside a large window filled with a white curtain and a notice that said, "Teas closed." But despite this forbidding notice, when Howl pressed a button at a small door beside the window, Miss Angorian opened the door. They all stared at her. For a fierce school-teacher, Miss Angorian was astonishingly young and slender and good-looking. She had sheets of blue-black hair hanging round her olive-brown, heart-shaped face, and enormous dark eyes. The only thing which suggested fierceness about her was the direct and clever way those enormous eyes looked and seemed to sum them up. "I'll take a small guess that you may be Howl Jenkins," Miss Angorian said to Howl. She had a low, melodious voice that was nevertheless rather amused and quite sure of itself. Howl was taken aback for an instant. Then his smile snapped on, and that, Sophie thought, was goodbye to the pleasant dreams of Letty and Mrs. Fairfax. For Miss Angorian was exactly the kind of lady someone like Howl could be trusted to fall in love with on the spot. And not only Howl. Michael was staring admiringly too, and though all the houses around were apparently deserted, Sophie had no doubt that they were full of people who all knew both Howl and Miss Angorian and were watching with interest to see what would happen. She could feel their invisible eyes. Market Chipping was like that too. "And you must be Miss Angorian," said Howl. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I made a stupid mistake last week and carried off my nephew's English homework instead of a rather important paper I had with me. I gather Neil gave it to you as proof that he wasn't shirking." "He did," said Miss Angorian. "You'd better come in and collect it." Sophie was sure the invisible eyes in all the houses goggled, and the invisible necks craned, as Howl and Michael and she trooped in through Miss Angorian's door and up a flight of stairs to Miss Angorian's tiny, severe living room. Miss Angorian said considerately to Sophie, "Won't you sit down?" Sophie was still shaking from that horseless carriage. She sat down gladly on one of the 2 chairs. It was not very comfortable. Miss Angorian's room was not designed for comfort but for study. Though many of the things in it were strange, Sophie understood the walls of books and the piles of paper on the table and the folders stacked on the floor. She sat and watched Michael staring sheepishly and Howl turning on his charm. "How is it you come to know who I am?" Howl asked beguilingly. "You seem to have caused a lot of gossip in this town," Miss Angorian said, busy sorting through papers on the table. "And what have those people who gossip told you?" Howl asked. He leaned languishingly on the end of the table and tried to catch Miss Angorian's eye. "That you disappear and turn up rather unpredictably, for one thing," Miss Angorian said. "And what else?" Howl followed Miss Angorian's movements with such a look that Sophie knew Letty's only chance was for Miss Angorian to fall instantly in love with Howl too. But Miss Angorian was not that kind of lady. She said, "Many other things, few of them to your credit," and caused Michael to blush by looking at him and then at Sophie in a way that suggested these things were not fit for their ears. She held a yellowish, wavy-edged paper out to Howl. "Here it is," she said severely. "Do you know what it is?" "Of course," said Howl. "Then please tell me," said Miss Angorian. Howl took the paper. There was a bit of a scuffle as he tried to take Miss Angorian's hand with it. Miss Angorian won the scuffle and put her hands behind her back. Howl smiled meltingly and passed the paper to Michael. "You tell her," he said. Michael's blushing face lit up as soon as he looked at it. "It's the spell! Oh, I can do this one. It's enlargement, isn't it?" "That's what I thought," Miss Angorian said rather accusingly. "I'd like to know what you were doing with such a thing." "Miss Angorian," said Howl, "if you have heard all those things about me, you must know I wrote my doctoral thesis on charms and spells. You look as if you suspect me of working black magic. I assure you I never worked any kind of spell in my life." Sophie could not stop herself making a small snort at this blatant lie. "With my hand on my heart," Howl added, giving Sophie an irritated frown. "This spell is for study purposes only. It's very old and rare. That's why I wanted it back." "Well, you have it back," Miss Angorian said briskly. "Before you go, would you mind giving me my homework sheet in return? Photocopies cost money." Howl brought out the grey paper willingly and held it just out of reach. "This poem now," he said. "It's been bothering me. Silly, really, but I can't remember the rest of it. By Walter Raleigh, isn't it?" Miss Angorian gave him a withering look. "Certainly not. It's by John Donne, and it's very well known indeed. I have the book with it in here, if you want to refresh your memory." "Please," said Howl, and from the way his eyes followed Miss Angorian as she went to her wall of books, Sophie realized that this was the real reason why Howl had come into this strange land where his family lived. But Howl was not above killing two birds with one stone. "Miss Angorian," he said pleadingly, following her contours as she stretched for the book, "would you consider coming out for some supper with me tonight?" Miss Angorian turned round with a large book in her hands, looking more severe than ever. "I would not," she said. "Mr. Jenkins, I don't know what you've heard about me, but you must have heard that I still consider myself engaged to Ben Sullivan." "Never heard of him," said Howl. "My fiancé," said Miss Angorian. "He disappeared some years back. Now do you wish me to read this poem out to you?" "Do that," Howl said, quite unrepentant. "You have such a lovely voice." "Then I'll start with the second verse," Miss Angorian said, "since you have the first verse there in your hand." She read very well, not only melodiously, but in a way which made the second verse fit the rhythm of the first, which in Sophie's opinion it did not do at all. "If thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights, till age snow-white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou returnest, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear, nowhere lives a woman true and fair. If thou—" Howl had gone a terrible white. Sophie could see sweat standing on his face. "Thank you," he said. "Stop there. I won't trouble you for the rest. Even the good woman is untrue in the last verse, isn't she? I remember now. Silly of me. John Donne, of course." Miss Angorian lowered the book and stared at him. He forced up a smile. "We must be going now. Sure you won't change your mind about supper?" "I will not," said Miss Angorian. "Are you quite well, Mr. Jenkins?" "In the pink," Howl said. And he hustled Michael and Sophie away down the stairs and into the horrible horseless carriage. The invisible watchers in the houses must have thought Miss Angorian was chasing them with a sabre, if they judged from the speed with which Howl packed them into it and drove off. "What's the matter?" Michael asked, as the carriage went roaring and grinding uphill again, and Sophie clung to bits of seat for dear life. Howl pretended not to hear, so Michael waited until Howl was locking it into its shed and asked again. "Oh, nothing," Howl said airily, leading the way back to the yellow house called Rivendell. "The Witch of the Waste has caught up with me with her curse, that's all. Bound to happen sooner or later." He seemed to be calculating or doing sums in his head while he opened the garden gate. 10,000, Sophie heard him murmur. That brings it to about Midsummer Day. What is brought to Midsummer Day? Asked Sophie. The time I'll be 10,000 days old, Howl said. And that, Mrs. Knows, he said, swinging into the garden of Rivendell, is the day I shall have to go back to the Witch of the Waste. Sophie and Michael hung back on the path, staring at Howl's back, so mysteriously labelled Welsh Rugby. If I keep clear of mermaids, they heard him mutter, and don't touch a mandrake root. Michael called out, Do we have to go back into that house? And Sophie called, What will the witch do? I shudder to think, Howl said. You don't have to go back in, Michael. He opened the wavy glass door. Inside was the familiar room of the castle. Calcifer's sleepy flames were colouring the walls faintly blue-black in the dusk. Howl flung back his long sleeves and gave Calcifer a log. She caught up, old Blueface, he said. I know, said Calcifer. I felt it take. Chapter 12, in which Sophie becomes Howl's old mother. Sophie did not see much point in blackening Howl's name to the king, now that the witch had caught up with him, but Howl said it was more important than ever. I shall need everything I've got just to escape the witch, he said. I can't have the king after me as well. So the following afternoon, Sophie put on her new clothes and sat, feeling very fine, if rather stiff, waiting for Michael to get ready and for Howl to finish in the bathroom. While she waited, she told Calcifer about the strange country where Howl's family lived. It took her mind off the king. Calcifer was very interested. I knew he came from foreign parts, he said, but this sounds like another world. Clever of the witch to send the curse in from there. Very clever all round. That's magic I admire, using something that exists anyway and turning it round into a curse. I did wonder about it when you and Michael were reading it the other day. That fool Howl told her too much about himself. Sophie gazed at Calcifer's thin blue face. It did not surprise her to find Calcifer admired the curse, any more than it surprised her when he called Howl a fool. He was always insulting Howl. But she never could work out if Calcifer really hated Howl. Calcifer looked so evil anyway that it was hard to tell. Calcifer moved his orange eyes to look into Sophie's. I'm scared too, he said. I shall suffer with Howl if the witch catches him. If you don't break the contract before she does, I won't be able to help you at all. Before Sophie could ask more, Howl came dashing out of the bathroom, looking his very finest, scenting the room with roses, and yelling for Michael. Michael clattered downstairs in his new blue velvet. Sophie stood up and collected her trusty stick. It was time to go. You look wonderfully rich and stately, Michael said to her. She does me credit, said Howl, apart from that awful old stick. Some people, said Sophie, are thoroughly self-centred. This stick goes with me. I need it for moral support. Howl looked at the ceiling, but he did not argue. They took their stately way into the streets of Kingsbury. Sophie, of course, looked back to see what the castle was like here. She saw a big arched gateway surrounding a small black door. The rest of the castle seemed to be a blank stretch of plastered wall between two carved stone houses. Before you ask, said Howl, it's really just a disused stable. This way. They walked through the streets, looking at least as fine as any of the passers-by. Not that many people were about. Kingsbury was a long way south, and it was a bakingly hot day there. The pavements shimmered. Sophie discovered another disadvantage to being old. You felt queer in hot weather. The elaborate buildings wavered in front of her eyes. She was annoyed because she wanted to look at the place, but all she had was a dim impression of golden domes and tall houses. "By the way," Howl said, "Mrs. Penstemon will call you Mrs. Pendragon. Pendragon's the name I go under here." "Whatever for?" said Sophie. "For disguise," said Howl. "Pendragon's a lovely name, much better than Jenkins." "I get by quite well with a plain name," Sophie said, as they turned into a blessedly narrow, cool street. "We can't all be Mad Hatters," said Howl. Mrs. Penstemon's house was gracious and tall, near the end of the narrow street. It had orange trees in tubs on either side of its handsome front door. This door was opened by an elderly footman in black velvet, who led them into a wonderfully cool black-and-white checkered marble hall, where Michael tried secretly to wipe sweat off his face. Howl, who always seemed to be cool, treated the footman as an old friend, and made jokes to him. The footman passed them on to a page boy in red velvet. Sophie, as the boy led them ceremoniously up polished stairs, began to see why this made good practice for meeting the king. She felt as if she were in a palace already. When the boy ushered them into a shaded drawing-room, she was sure even a palace could not be this elegant. Everything in the room was blue and gold and white and small and fine. Mrs. Penstemon was finest of all. She was tall and thin, and she sat bolt upright in a blue and gold embroidered chair, supporting herself rigidly with one hand in a gold mesh mitten on a gold-topped cane. She wore old gold silk in a very stiff and old-fashioned style, finished off with an old gold headdress, not unlike a crown, which tied in a large old gold bow beneath her gaunt eagle face. She was the finest and most frightening lady Sophie had ever seen. "Ah, my dear Howl," she said, holding out a gold mesh mitten. Howl bent and kissed the mitten, as he was obviously supposed to. He did it very gracefully, but it was rather spoiled from back view by Howl flapping his other hand furiously at Michael behind his back. Michael, a little too slowly, realized he was supposed to stand by the door beside the page boy. He backed there in a hurry, only too pleased to get as far away from Mrs. Penstemon as he could. "Mrs. Penstemon, allow me to present my old mother," Howl said, waving his hand at Sophie. Since Sophie felt just like Michael, Howl had to flap his hand at her too. "Charmed, delighted," said Mrs. Penstemon, and she held her gold mitten out to Sophie. Sophie was not sure if Mrs. Penstemon meant her to kiss the mitten as well, but she could not bring herself to try. She laid her own hand on the mitten instead. The hand under it felt like an old, cold claw. After feeling it, Sophie was quite surprised that Mrs. Penstemon was alive. "Forgive my not standing up, Mrs. Pendragon," Mrs. Penstemon said. "My health is not good. It forced me to retire from teaching 3 years ago. Pray sit down, both of you." Trying not to shake with nerves, Sophie sat grandly in the embroidered chair opposite Mrs. Penstemon's, supporting herself on her stick in what she hoped was the same elegant way. Howl spread himself gracefully in a chair next to it. He looked quite at home, and Sophie envied him. "I am 86, Mrs. Penstemon announced. "How old are you, my dear Mrs. Pendragon?" 90, Sophie said, that being the first high number that came into her head. "So old?" Mrs. Penstemon said, with what may have been slight stately envy. "How lucky you are to move so nimbly still." "Oh, yes, she's so wonderfully nimble," Howl agreed, "that sometimes there's no stopping her." Mrs. Penstemon gave him a look which told Sophie she had been a teacher at least as fierce as Miss Angorian. "I'm talking to your mother," she said. "I dare say she is as proud of you as I am. We are two old ladies who both had a hand in forming you. You are, one might say, our joint creation." "Don't you think I did any of me myself, then?" Howl asked. "Put in just a few touches of my own?" "A few, and those not altogether to my liking," Mrs. Pentstemon replied. "But you will not wish to sit here and hear yourself being discussed. You will go down and sit on the terrace, taking your page boy with you, where Hunch will bring you both a cool drink. Go along." If Sophie had not been so nervous herself, she might have laughed at the expression on Howl's face. He had obviously not expected this to happen at all, but he got up, with only a slight shrug, made a slight warning face at Sophie, and shooed Michael out of the room ahead of him. Mrs. Pentstemon turned her rigid body very slightly to watch them go. Then she nodded at the page boy, who scuttled out of the room too. After that, Mrs. Pentstemon turned herself back towards Sophie, and Sophie felt more nervous than ever. "I prefer him with black hair," Mrs. Pentstemon announced. "That boy is going to the bad." "Who? Michael?" Sophie said, bewildered. "Not the servitor," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "I do not think he is clever enough to cause me concern. I am talking about Howl, Mrs. Pendragon." "Oh," said Sophie, wondering why Mrs. Pentstemon only said going. Howl had surely arrived at the bad long ago. "Take his whole appearance," Mrs. Pentstemon said sweepingly. "Look at his clothes." "He is always very careful about his appearance," Sophie agreed, and wondered why she was putting it so mildly. "And always was. I am careful about my appearance, too, and I see no harm in that," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "But what call has he to be walking around in a charmed suit? It is a dazzling attraction charm directed at ladies. Very well done, I admit, and barely detectable even to my trained eye, since it appears to have been darned into the seams, and one which will render him almost irresistible to ladies. This represents a downward trend into black arts, which must surely cause you some motherly concern, Mrs. Pendragon." Sophie thought uneasily about the grey and scarlet suit. She had darned the seams without noticing it had anything particular about it, but Mrs. Pentstemon was an expert on magic, and Sophie was only an expert on clothes. Mrs. Pentstemon put both gold mittens on top of her stick, and canted her stiff body so that both her trained and piercing eyes stared into Sophie's. Sophie felt more and more nervous and uneasy. "My life is nearly over," Mrs. Pentstemon announced. "I have felt death tiptoeing close for some time now." "Oh, I'm sure that isn't so," Sophie said, trying to sound soothing. It was hard to sound like anything with Mrs. Pentstemon staring at her like that. "I assure you it is so," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "That is why I was anxious to see you, Mrs. Pendragon. Howl, you see, was my last pupil, and by far my best. I was about to retire when he came to me out of a foreign land. I thought my work was done when I trained Benjamin Sullivan, whom you probably know better as Wizard Solomon, rest his soul, and procured him the post of royal magician. Oddly enough, he came from the same country as Howl. Then Howl came, and I saw at a glance that he had twice the imagination and twice the abilities, and though I admit he had some faults of character, I knew he was a force for good. Good, Mrs. Pendragon. But what is he now?" "What indeed?" Sophie said. "Something has happened to him," Mrs. Pentstemon said, still staring piercingly at Sophie, "and I am determined to put that right before I die." "What do you think has happened?" Sophie asked uncomfortably. "I must rely on you to tell me that," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "My feeling is that he has gone the same way as the Witch of the West. They tell me she was not wicked once, though I have this only on hearsay, since she is older than either of us and keeps herself young by her arts. Howl has gifts in the same order as hers. It seems as if those of high ability cannot resist some extra dangerous stroke of cleverness, which results in a fatal flaw and begins a slow decline to evil. Do you by any chance have a clue what it might be?" Calcifer's voice came into Sophie's mind, saying, "The contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run." She felt a little chilly, in spite of the heat of the day blowing through the open windows of the shaded, elegant room. "Yes," she said. "He's made some sort of contract with his fire demon." Mrs. Pentstemmon's hand shook a little on her stick. "That will be it. You must break the contract, Mrs. Pendragon." "I would, if I knew how," Sophie said. "Surely your maternal feelings and your own strong magic gift will tell you how," Mrs. Pentstemon said. "I have been looking at you, Mrs. Pendragon, though you may not have noticed." "Oh, I noticed, Mrs. Pentstemon," Sophie said. "And I like your gift," said Mrs. Pentstemon. "It brings life to things, such as that stick in your hand which you have evidently talked to the extent that it has become what the layman would call a magic wand. I think you would not find it too hard to break the contract." "Yes, but I need to know what the terms of it are," Sophie said. "Did Howl tell you I was a witch? Because if he did—" "He did not. There's no need to be coy. You can rely on my experience to know these things," said Mrs. Pentstemon.
Then, to Sophie's relief, she shut her eyes. It was like a strong light being turned off.
"I do not know, nor do I wish to know about such contracts," she said.
Her cane wobbled again, as if she might be shuddering. Her mouth quirked into a line suggesting she had unexpectedly bitten on a peppercorn.
"But I now see," she said, "what has happened to the witch. She made a contract with a fire demon, and over the years that demon has taken control of her. Demons do not understand good and evil, but they can be bribed into a contract, provided the human offers them something valuable, something only humans have. This prolongs the life of both human and demon, and the human gets the demon's magic power to add to his or her own."
Mrs. Pentstemon opened her eyes again.
"That is all I can bear to say on the subject," she said, "except to advise you to find out what that demon got. Now I must bid you farewell. I have to rest a while."
And like magic, which it probably was, the door opened, and the page boy came in to usher Sophie out of the room. Sophie was extremely glad to go. She was all but squirming with embarrassment by then. She looked back at Mrs. Pentstemon's rigid, upright form as the door closed, and wondered if Mrs. Pentstemon would have made her feel this bad if she had really and truly been Howl's old mother. Sophie rather thought she would.
"I take my hat off to Howl for standing her as a teacher for more than a day," she murmured to herself.
"Madam?" asked the page boy, thinking Sophie was talking to him.
"I said go slowly down the stairs or I can't keep up," Sophie told him. Her knees were wobbling. "You young boys dash about so," she said. The page boy took her slowly and considerately down the shiny stairs.
Halfway down, Sophie recovered enough from Mrs. Pentstemon's personality to think of some of the things Mrs. Pentstemon had actually said. She had said Sophie was a witch. Oddly enough, Sophie accepted this without any trouble at all. That explained the popularity of certain hats, she thought, It explained Jane Farrier's Count Whatsit. It possibly explained the jealousy of the Witch of the Waste. It was as if Sophie had always known this, but she had thought it was not proper to have a magic gift because she was the eldest of 3. Letty had been far more sensible about such things. Then she thought of the grey and scarlet suit and nearly fell downstairs with dismay. She was the one who had put the charm on that. She could hear herself now murmuring to it. "Built to pull in the girls," she had told it, and of course it did. It had charmed Letty that day in the orchard. Yesterday, somewhat disguised, it must have had its secret effect on Miss Angorian too. "Oh dear," Sophie thought. "I've gone and doubled the number of hearts he'll have broken. I must get that suit off him somehow." Howl, in that same suit, was waiting in the cool black-and-white hall with Michael. Michael nudged Howl in a worried way as Sophie came slowly down the stairs behind the page boy. Howl looked saddened. "You seem a bit ragged," he said. "I think we'd better skip seeing the king. I'll go and blacken my own name when I make your excuses. I can say my wicked ways have made you ill. That could be true from the look of you." Sophie certainly did not wish to see the king, but she thought of what Calcifer had said. If the king commanded Howl to go into the waste, and the witch caught him, Sophie's own chance of being young again would have gone too. She shook her head. "After Mrs. Pentstemon," she said, "the King of Ingray will seem just like an ordinary person." Chapter 13, in which Sophie blackens Howl's name. Sophie was feeling decidedly queer again when they reached the palace. Its many golden domes dazzled her. The way to the front entrance was up a huge flight of steps, with a soldier in scarlet standing guard every 6 steps. The poor boys must have been near fainting in the heat, Sophie thought, as she puffed her way dizzily up past them. At the top of the steps were archways, halls, corridors, lobbies, one after another. Sophie lost count of how many. At every archway a splendidly dressed person wearing white gloves, still somehow white in spite of the heat, inquired their business, and then led them on to the next personage in the next archway. "Mrs. Pendragon to see the king!" the voice of each echoed down the halls. About halfway, Howl was politely detached and told to wait. Michael and Sophie went on, being handed from person to person. They were taken upstairs, after which the splendid persons were dressed in blue instead of red, and handed on again until they came to an ante-room panelled in 100 different-coloured woods. There Michael was peeled off and made to wait too. Sophie, who by this time was not at all sure whether she was not having some strange dream, was ushered through huge double doors, and this time the echoing voice said, "Your Majesty, here is Mrs. Pendragon to see you." And there was the king, not on a throne, but sitting in a rather square chair with only a little gold leaf on it, near the middle of a large room, and dressed much more modestly than the persons who waited on him. He was quite alone, like an ordinary person. True, he sat with one leg thrust out in a kingly sort of manner, and he was handsome in a plump, slightly vague way. But to Sophie he seemed quite youthful, and just a touch too proud of being a king. She felt he ought with that face to have been more unsure of himself. He said, "Well, what does Wizard Howl's mother want to see me about?" And Sophie was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact that she was standing talking to the king. It was, she thought dizzily, as if the man sitting there and the huge important thing which was kingship were 2 separate things that just happened to occupy the same chair, and she found she had forgotten every word of the careful, delicate things Howl had told her to say. But she had to say something.
"He sent me to tell you he's not going to look for your brother," she said. "Your Majesty."
She stared at the king. The king stared back. It was a disaster.
"Are you sure?" asked the king. "The wizard seemed quite willing when I talked to him."
The one thing Sophie had left in her head was that she was here to blacken Howl's name, so she said, "He lied about that. He didn't want to annoy you. He's a slitherer outer, if you know what I mean, Your Majesty."
"And he hopes to slither out of finding my brother Justin?" said the king. "I see. Won't you sit down, since I see you are not young, and tell me the wizard's reasons?"
There was another plain chair rather a long way from the king. Sophie creaked herself down into it and sat with her hands propped on her stick like Mrs. Pentstemon, hoping that would make her feel better. But her mind was still simply a roaring white blank of stage fright. All she could think of to say was, "Only a coward would send his old mother along to plead for him. You can see what he's like, just from that, Your Majesty."
"It is an unusual step," the king said gravely, "but I told him that I'd make it worth his while if he agreed."
"Oh, he doesn't care about money," Sophie said. "But he's scared stiff of the Witch of the Waste, you see. She put a curse on him, and it's just caught up with him."
"Then he has every reason to be scared,"
the king said with a slight shiver.
"But tell me more, please, about the wizard."
More about Howl, Sophie thought desperately. I have to blacken his name. Her mind was such a blank that for a second it actually seemed to her that Howl had no faults at all. How stupid.
"Well, he's fickle, careless, selfish, and hysterical," she said. "Half the time I think he doesn't care what happens to anyone as long as he's all right. But then I find out how awfully kind he's been to someone. Then I think he's kind just when it suits him. Only then I find out he undercharges poor people. I don't know, Your Majesty. He's a mess." "My impression," said the king, "was that Howl is an unprincipled, slippery rogue with a glib tongue and a clever mind. Would you agree?"
"How well you put it," Sophie said heartily. "But you left out how vain he is and—" She looked suspiciously at the king across the yards of carpet. He seemed so surprisingly ready to help her blacken Howl's name. The king was smiling. It was the slightly uncertain smile that went with the person he was, rather than the king he ought to be.
"Thank you, Mrs. Pendragon," he said. "Your outspokenness has taken a weight off my mind. The wizard agreed to look for my brother so readily that I thought I had picked the wrong man after all. I feared he was someone who was either unable to resist showing off or would do anything for money. But you have shown me he's just the man I need."
"Oh, confound it!" Sophie cried out. "He sent me to tell you he wasn't."
"And so you did."
The king hitched his chair an inch towards Sophie's.
"Let me be equally outspoken now," he said. "Mrs. Pendragon, I need my brother back badly. It's not just that I am fond of him and regret the quarrel we had. It's not even that certain people are whispering that I did away with him myself, which anyone who knows us both knows to be perfect nonsense. No, Mrs. Pendragon. The fact is, my brother Justin is a brilliant general, and with High Norland and Strangia about to declare war on us, I can't do without him. The witch has threatened me too, you know. Now that all reports agree that Justin did indeed go into the waste, I am certain that the witch meant me to be without him when I needed him most. I think she took Wizard Solomon as bait to fetch Justin, and it follows that I need a fairly clever and unscrupulous wizard to get him back."
"Howl will just run away," Sophie warned the king.
"No," said the king, "I don't think he will. The fact that he sent you tells me that. He did it to show me he was too much of a coward to care what I thought of him. Isn't that right, Mrs. Pendragon?"
Sophie nodded. She wished she could have remembered all Howl's delicate remarks. The king would have understood them, even if she didn't.
"Not the act of a vain man," the king said, "but no one would do that except as a last resort, which shows me that Wizard Howl will do what I want if I make it clear to him that his last resort has failed."
"I think you may be, taking delicate hints that aren't there, Your Majesty," Sophie said.
"I think not,"
the king smiled. His slightly vague features had all firmed up. He was sure he was right.
"Tell Wizard Howl, Mrs. Pendragon, that I am appointing him royal wizard as from now, with our royal command to find Prince Justin alive or dead before the year is out. You have our leave to go now."
He held out his hand to Sophie, just like Mrs. Pentstemon, but a little less royally. Sophie levered herself up, wondering if she were meant to kiss this hand or not. But since she felt more like raising her stick and beating the king over the head with it, she shook the king's hand and gave a creaking little curtsy. It seemed to be the right thing to do. The king gave her a friendly smile as she hobbled away to the double doors. "Oh, curses!" she muttered to herself. It was not only exactly what Howl did not want. Howl would now move the castle 1,000 miles away. Letty, Martha, and Michael would all be miserable, and no doubt there would be torrents of green slime into the bargain as well. "It comes of being the eldest," she muttered, while she was shoving the heavy doors open. "You just can't win." And here was another thing which had gone wrong. In her annoyance and disappointment, Sophie had somehow come out through the wrong set of double doors. This ante-room had mirrors all round it. In them she could see her own little bent, hobbling shape in its fine grey dress. A great many people in blue court dress, others in suits as fine as Howl's, but no Michael. Michael, of course, was hanging about in the ante-room, panelled in 100 kinds of wood. "Oh, drat!" said Sophie. One of the courtiers hastened up to her and bowed. "Madam Sorceress, can I be of assistance?" He was an undersized young man, rather red-eyed. Sophie stared at him. "Oh, good gracious," she said. "So the spell worked." "It did indeed," said the small courtier a little ruefully. "I disarmed him while he was sneezing, and he's now suing me. But the important thing," his face spread into a happy smile, "is that my dear Jane has come back to me. Now, what can I do for you? I feel responsible for your happiness." "I'm not sure that it mightn't be the other way round," Sophie said. "Are you by any chance the Count of Cataract?" "At your service," said the small courtier, bowing. Jane Farrier must be a good foot taller than he is, Sophie thought. It's all definitely my fault. "Yes, you can help me," she said, and explained about Michael. The Count of Cataract assured her that Michael would be fetched and brought down to the entrance hall to meet her. It was no trouble at all. He took Sophie to a gloved attendant himself and handed her over with much bowing and smiling. Sophie was handed to another attendant, then another, just as before, and eventually hobbled her way down to the stairs guarded by the soldiers. Michael was not there, nor was Howl, but that was small relief to Sophie. She thought she might have guessed it would be like this. The Count of Cataract was obviously a person who never got a thing right, and she was another herself. It was probably lucky she had even found the way out. By now she was so tired and hot and dejected that she decided not to wait for Michael. She wanted to sit down in the fireside chair and tell Calcifer the mess she'd made of things. She hobbled down the grand staircase. She hobbled down a grand avenue. She stumped along another, where spires and towers and gilded roofs circled around in giddy profusion, and she realized it was worse than she had thought. She was lost. She had absolutely no idea how to find the disguised stable where the castle entrance was. She turned up another handsome thoroughfare at random, but she didn't recognize that either. By now she didn't even know the way back to the palace. She tried asking people she met. Most of them seemed as hot and tired as she was.
"Wizard Pendragon," they said. "Who's he?"
Sophie hobbled on hopelessly. She was near giving up and sitting on the next doorstep for the night when she passed the end of the narrow street where Mrs. Pentstemmon's house was. "Ah," she thought, "I can go and ask the footman. He and Howl was so friendly that he must know where Howl lives." So she turned down the street. The Witch of the Waste was coming up it toward her. How Sophie recognized the witch would be hard to say. Her face was different. Her hair, instead of being orderly chestnut curls, was a rippling mass of red hanging almost to her waist, and she was dressed in floating flutters of auburn and pale yellow. Very cool and lovely she looked. Sophie knew her at once. She almost stopped, but not quite. "There's no reason she should remember me," Sophie thought. "I must be just one of hundreds of people she's enchanted." And Sophie stumped boldly on, thumping her stick on the cobbles and reminding herself, in case of trouble, that Mrs. Pentstemon had said that same stick had become a powerful object. That was another mistake. The witch came floating up the little street, smiling, twirling her parasol, followed by two sulky-looking page boys in orange velvet. When she came level with Sophie, she stopped, and tawny perfume filled Sophie's nose. "Why, it's Miss Hatter," the witch said, laughing. "I never forget a face, particularly if I've made it myself. What are you doing here, dressed up all so fine? If you're thinking of calling on that Mrs. Pentstemon, you can save yourself the trouble. The old biddy's dead." "Dead?" said Sophie. She had a silly impulse to add, "But she was alive an hour ago," and she stopped herself, because death is like that. People are alive until they die. "Yes." "Dead," said the witch. "She refused to tell me where somebody was that I want to find. She said, 'Over my dead body.' So I took her at her word." "She's looking for Howl," Sophie thought. "Now what do I do?" If she'd not been so very hot and tired, Sophie would have been almost too scared to think. For a witch who could kill Mrs. Pentstemon would have no trouble with Sophie, stick or no stick. And if she suspected for a moment that Sophie knew where Howl was, that could be the end of Sophie. Perhaps it was just as well Sophie could not remember where the castle entrance was. "I don't know who this person is that you've killed," she said, "but that makes you a wicked murderess." But the witch did seem to suspect anyway. She said, "But I thought you said you were going to call on Mrs. Pentstemon." "No," said Sophie. "It was you said that. I don't have to know her to call you wicked for killing her." "Then where were you going?" said the witch. Sophie was tempted to tell the witch to mind her own business, but that was asking for trouble. So she said the only other thing she could think of. "I'm going to see the king," she said. The witch laughed disbelievingly. "But will the king see you?" "Yes, of course," Sophie declared, trembling with terror and anger. "I made an appointment. I'm going to petition him for better conditions for hatters. I keep going, you see, even after what you did to me." "Then you're going in the wrong direction," said the witch. "The palace is behind you." "Oh, is it?" said Sophie. She didn't have to pretend to be surprised. "Then I must have got turned around. I've been a little vague about directions ever since you made me like this." The witch laughed heartily and did not believe a word of it. "Then come with me," she said, "and I'll show you the way to the palace." There seemed nothing Sophie could do but turn round and stump beside the witch, with the two page boys trudging sullenly behind them both. Anger and hopelessness settled over Sophie. She looked at the witch floating gracefully beside her, and remembered Mrs. Pentstemon had said the witch was an old woman, really. It's not fair, Sophie thought, but there was nothing she could do about it. "Why did you make me like this?" she demanded as they went up a grand thoroughfare with a fountain at the top of it. "You were preventing me getting some information I needed," the witch said. "I got it in the end, of course." Sophie was quite mystified by this. She was wondering whether it would do any good to say there must be some mistake, when the witch added, "Though I dare say you had no idea you were," and laughed, as if that was the funniest part of it. "Have you heard of a land called Wales?" she asked. "No," said Sophie. "Is it under the sea?" The witch found this funnier than ever. "Not at the moment," she said. "It's where Wizard Howl comes from. You know Wizard Howl, don't you?" "Only by hearsay," Sophie lied. "He eats girls. He's as wicked as you." But she felt rather cold. It did not seem to be due to the fountain they were passing at that moment. Beyond the fountain, across a pink marble plaza, were the stone stairs with the palace at the top. "There you are. There's the palace," said the witch. "Are you sure you can manage all those stairs?" "None the better for you," said Sophie. "Make me young again and I'll run up them, even in this heat." "That wouldn't be half so funny," said the witch. "Up you go. And if you do persuade the king to see you, remind him that his grandfather sent me to the waste, and I bear him a grudge for that." Sophie looked hopelessly up the long flight of stairs. At least there was nobody but soldiers on them. With the luck she was having today, it would not have surprised her to find Michael and Howl on their way down. Since the witch was obviously going to stand there and make sure she went up, Sophie had no choice but to climb them. Up she hobbled, past the sweating soldiers, all the way to the palace entrance again, hating the witch more with every step. She turned round, panting, at the top. The witch was still there, a floating russet shape at the foot, with two small orange figures beside her, waiting to see her thrown out of the palace. "Drat her," said Sophie. She hobbled over to the guards at the archway. Her bad luck still held. There was no sign of Michael or Howl in the reaches beyond. She was forced to say to the guards, "There was something I forgot to tell the king." They remembered her. They let her inside, to be received by a personage in white gloves. And before Sophie had collected her wits, the palace machinery was in motion again, and she was being handed from person to person just like the first time, until she arrived at the same double doors, and the same person in blue was announcing, "Mrs. Pendragon to see you again, Your Majesty." It was like a bad dream, Sophie thought, as she went into the same large room. She seemed to have no choice but to blacken Howl's name again. The trouble was, what with all that had happened, and stage fright again into the bargain, her mind was blanker than ever. The king, this time, was standing at a large desk in one corner, rather anxiously moving flags about on a map. He looked up and said pleasantly, "They tell me there was something you forgot to say." "Yes," said Sophie. "Howl says he'll only look for Prince Justin if you promise him your daughter's hand in marriage." "What put that into my head?" she thought. "He'll have us both executed." The king gave her a concerned look. "Mrs. Pendragon, you must know that's quite out of the question," he said. "I can see you must be very worried about your son to suggest it, but you can't keep him tied to your apron strings forever, you know, and my mind is made up. Please come and sit in this chair. You seem tired." Sophie tottered to the low chair the king pointed to and sank into it, wondering when the guards would arrive to arrest her. The king looked vaguely around. "My daughter was here just now," he said. To Sophie's considerable surprise, he bent down and looked under the desk. "Valeria," he called. "Vally, come on out. This way. There's a good girl." There was a shuffling noise. After a second, Princess Valeria shunted herself out from under the desk in sitting position, grinning benignly. She had 4 teeth, but she was not old enough to have grown a proper head of hair. All she had was a ring of wispy whiteness above her ears. When she saw Sophie, she grinned wider yet and reached out with the hand she had just been sucking and took hold of Sophie's dress. Sophie's dress responded with a spreading wet stain as the princess hauled herself to her feet on it. Staring up into Sophie's face, Valeria addressed a friendly remark to her in what was clearly a private foreign language. "Oh," said Sophie, feeling an awful fool. "I understand how a parent feels, Mrs. Pendragon," said the king. Chapter 14, in which a royal wizard catches a cold. Sophie rode back to the castle's Kingsbury entrance in one of the king's coaches, drawn by 4 horses. On it also were a coachman, a groom, and a footman. A sergeant and 6 royal troopers went with it to guard it. The reason was Princess Valeria. She had climbed into Sophie's lap. As the coach clattered the short way downhill, Sophie's dress was still covered with the wet marks of Valeria's royal approval. Sophie smiled a little. She thought Martha might have a point after all, wanting children, although 10 Valerias struck her as a bit much. As Valeria had scrambled over her, Sophie remembered hearing that the witch had threatened Valeria in some way, and she found herself saying to Valeria, "The witch shan't hurt you. I won't let her." The king had not said anything about that, but he had ordered out a royal coach for Sophie. The equipage drew to a very noisy halt outside the disguised stable. Michael shot out of the door and got in the way of the footman who was helping Sophie down. "Where did you get to?" he said. "I've been so worried, and Howl's terribly upset." "I'm sure he is," Sophie said apprehensively. "Because Mrs. Pentstemmon's dead," said Michael. Howl came to the door too. He looked pale and depressed. He was holding a scroll with red and blue royal seals dangling off it, which Sophie eyed guiltily. Howl gave the sergeant a gold piece and did not say a word until the coach and the troopers had gone clattering away. Then he said, "I make that 4 horses and 10 men just to get rid of one old woman. What did you do to the king?" Sophie followed Howl and Michael indoors, expecting to find the room covered with green slime, but it wasn't, and there was Calcifer flaring up the chimney, grinning his purple grin. Sophie sank into the chair. "I think the king got sick of me turning up and blackening your name. I went twice," she said. "Everything went wrong, and I met the witch on her way from killing Mrs. Pentstemon. What a day!" While Sophie described some of what had happened, Howl leaned on the mantelpiece, dangling the scroll as if he was thinking of feeding it to Calcifer. "Behold the new royal wizard," he said. "My name is very black." Then he began to laugh, much to the surprise of Sophie and Michael. "And what did she do to the Count of Cataract?" he laughed. "I should never have let her near the king." "I did blacken your name," Sophie protested. "I know. It was my miscalculation," Howl said. "Now, how am I going to go to poor Mrs. Pentstemon's funeral without the witch knowing? Any ideas, Calcifer?" It was clear that Howl was far more upset about Mrs. Pentstemon than anything else. Michael was the one who worried about the witch. He confessed next morning that he had had nightmares all night. He had dreamed she came through all the castle entrances at once. "Where's Howl?" he asked anxiously. Howl had gone out very early, leaving the bathroom full of the usual scented steam. He had not taken his guitar, and the doorknob was turned to green down. Even Calcifer knew no more than that. "Don't open the door to anyone," Calcifer said. "The witch knows all about the entrances, except the Porthaven one." This so alarmed Michael that he fetched some planks from the yard and wedged them crosswise over the door. Then he got to work at last on the spell they had got back from Miss Angorian. Half an hour later, the doorknob turned sharply to black down. The door began to bounce about. Michael clutched at Sophie. "Don't be afraid," he said shakily. "I'll keep you safe." The door bounced powerfully for a while, then it stopped. Michael had just let go of Sophie in great relief, when there came a violent explosion. The planks clattered to the floor, Calcifer plunged to the bottom of the grate, and Michael plunged into the broom cupboard, leaving Sophie standing there as the door burst open and Howl stormed in. "This is a bit much, Sophie," he said. "I do live here." He was soaking wet. The grey and scarlet suit was black and brown. His sleeves and the ends of his hair were dripping. Sophie looked at the doorknob, still turned to black down. Miss Angorian, she thought, and he went to see her in that charmed suit. "Where have you been?" she said. Howl sneezed. "Standing in the rain. None of your business," he said hoarsely. "What were those planks in aid of?" "I did them," Michael said, edging out of the broom cupboard. "The witch—" "You must think I don't know my business," Howl said irritably. "I have so many misdirection spells out that most people wouldn't find us at all. I give even the witch 3 days. Calcifer, I need a hot drink." Calcifer had been climbing up among his logs, but as Howl went over to the fireplace, he plunged down again. "Don't come near me like that. You're wet," he hissed. "Sophie," Howl said pleadingly. Sophie folded her arms pitilessly. "What about Letty?" she said. "I'm soaked through," said Howl. "I should have a hot drink." "And I said, what about Letty Hatter?" Sophie said. "Bother you then," said Howl. He shook himself. The water fell off him in a neat ring on the floor. Howl stepped out of it with his hair gleaming dry and his suit grey and scarlet and not even damp, and went to fetch the saucepan. "The world is full of hard-hearted women, Michael," he said. "I can name 3 without stopping to think." "One of them being Miss Angorian?" asked Sophie. Howl didn't answer. He ignored Sophie grandly for the rest of the morning, while he discussed moving the castle with Michael and Calcifer. Howl really was going to run away, just as she had warned the king he would, Sophie thought, as she sat and sewed more triangles of blue and silver suit together. She knew she must get Howl out of that grey and scarlet suit as soon as possible. "I don't think we need move the Porthaven entrance," Howl said. He conjured himself a handkerchief out of the air and blew his nose with a hoot which made Calcifer flicker uneasily. "But I want the moving castle well away from anywhere it's been before, and the Kingsbury entrance shut down." Someone knocked on the door then. Sophie noticed that Howl jumped and looked round as nervously as Michael. Neither of them answered the door. Coward, Sophie thought scornfully. She wondered why she had gone to all that trouble for Howl yesterday. "I must have been mad," she muttered to the blue and silver suit. "What about the Blackdown entrance?" Michael asked, when the person knocking seemed to have gone away. "That stays," Howl said, and conjured himself another handkerchief with a final sort of flick. It would, Sophie thought. Miss Angorian is outside it. Poor Letty. By the middle of the morning, Howl was conjuring handkerchiefs in 2s and 3s. They were floppy squares of paper, really, Sophie saw. He kept sneezing. His voice grew hoarser. He was conjuring handkerchiefs by the half-dozen soon. Ashes from the used ones were piled all round Calcifer. "Oh, why is it that whenever I go to Wales I always come back with a cold?" Howl croaked, and conjured himself a whole wad of tissues. Sophie snorted. "Did you say something?" Howl croaked. "No, but I was thinking that people who run away from everything deserve every cold they get," Sophie said. "People who are appointed to do something by the king and go courting in the rain instead have only themselves to blame." "You don't know everything I do, Mrs. Moralizer," Howl said. "Want me to write out a list before I go out another time?
I have looked for Prince Justin. Courting isn't the only thing I do when I go out." "When have you looked?" said Sophie. "Oh, how your ears flap and your long nose twitches," Howl croaked. "I looked when he first disappeared, of course. I was curious to know what Prince Justin was doing up this way when everyone knew Solomon had gone to the waste. I think someone must have sold him a dud finding spell, because he went right over into the Folding Valley and bought another from Mrs. Fairfax, and that fetched him back this way fairly naturally, where he stopped at the castle, and Michael sold him another finding spell and a disguise spell." Michael's hand went over his mouth. "Was that man in the green uniform Prince Justin?" "Yes, but I didn't mention the matter before," said Howl, "because the king might have thought you should have had the sense to sell him another dud. I had a conscience about it." "Conscience. Notice that word, Mrs. Longnose. I had a conscience." Howl conjured another wad of handkerchiefs and glowered at Sophie over them out of eyes that were now red-rimmed and watery. Then he stood up. "I feel ill," he announced. "I'm going to bed, where I may die." He tottered piteously to the stairs. "Bury me beside Mrs. Pentstemon," he croaked as he went up them to bed. Sophie applied herself to her sewing harder than ever. Here was her chance to get the grey and scarlet suit off Howl before it did more damage to Miss Angorian's heart. Unless, of course, Howl went to bed in his clothes, which she didn't put past him. So Howl must have been looking for Prince Justin when he went to Upper Folding and met Letty. Poor Letty, Sophie thought, putting brisk tiny stitches round her 57th blue triangle. Only another 40 or so to go. Howl's voice was presently heard shouting weakly, "Help me, someone! I'm dying from neglect up here." Sophie snorted. Michael left off working on his new spell and ran up and down stairs. Things became very restless. In the time it took Sophie to sew 10 more blue triangles, Michael ran upstairs with lemon and honey, with a particular book, with cough mixture, with a spoon to take the cough mixture with, and then with nose drops, throat pastils, gargle, pen, paper, 3 more books, and an infusion of willow bark. People kept knocking at the door, too, making Sophie jump and Calcifer flicker uneasily. When no one opened the door, some of the people went on hammering for 5 minutes or so, rightly thinking they were being ignored. By this time Sophie was becoming worried about the blue and silver suit. It was getting smaller and smaller. One cannot sew in that number of triangles without taking up quite a lot of cloth in the seams. "Michael," she said, when Michael came rushing downstairs again because Howl fancied a bacon sandwich for lunch. "Michael, is there a way of making small clothes larger?" "Oh, yes," said Michael. "That's just what my new spell is, when I get a chance to work on it. He wants 6 slices of bacon in the sandwich. Could you ask Calcifer?" Sophie and Calcifer exchanged speaking looks. "I don't think he's dying," Calcifer said. "I'll give you the rinds to eat if you bend your head down," Sophie said, laying down her sewing. It was easier to bribe Calcifer than bully him. They had bacon sandwiches for lunch, but Michael had to rush upstairs in the middle of eating his. He came down with the news that Howl wanted him to go into market chipping now, to get some things he needed for moving the castle. "But the witch, is it safe?" Sophie asked. Michael licked bacon grease off his fingers and dived into the broom cupboard. He came out with one of the dusty velvet cloaks slung round his shoulders. At least, the person who came out wearing the cloak was a burly man with a red beard. This person licked his fingers and said with Michael's voice, "Howl thinks I'll be safe enough like this. It's misdirection as well as disguise. I wonder if Letty will know me." The burly man opened the door green down and jumped out onto the slowly moving hills.
Peace descended. Calcifer settled and chinked. Howl had evidently realized that Sophie was not going to run about after him. There was silence upstairs. Sophie got up and cautiously hobbled to the broom cupboard. This was her chance to go and see Letty. Letty must be very miserable by now. Sophie was fairly sure Howl had not been near her since that day in the orchard. It might just do some good if Sophie were to tell her that her feelings were caused by a charmed suit. Anyway, she owed it to Letty to tell her. The 7-league boots were not in the cupboard. Sophie could not believe it at first. She turned everything out, and there was nothing there but ordinary buckets, brooms, and the other velvet cloak. "Drat the man!" Sophie exclaimed. Howl had obviously made sure she would not follow him anywhere again. She was putting everything back into the cupboard when someone knocked at the door. Sophie, as usual, jumped and hoped they would go away. But this person seemed more determined than most. Whoever it was went on knocking, or perhaps hurling him or herself at the door, for the sound was more a steady whump, whump, whump than proper knocking. After 5 minutes, they were still doing it. Sophie looked at the uneasy green flickers which were all she could see of Calcifer. "Is it the witch?" "No," said Calcifer, muffled among his logs. "It's the castle door. Someone must be running along beside us. We're going quite fast." "Is it the scarecrow?" Sophie asked, and her chest gave a tremor at the mere idea. "It's flesh and blood," Calcifer said. His blue face climbed up into the chimney, looking puzzled. "I'm not sure what it is, except that it wants to come in badly. I don't think it means any harm." Since the whump whump just kept on, giving Sophie an irritable feeling of urgency, she decided to open the door and put a stop to it. Besides, she was curious about what it was. She still had the second velvet cloak in her hand from turning out the broom cupboard, so she threw it round her shoulders as she went to the door. Calcifer stared. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he bent his head down voluntarily. Great crackles of laughter came from under the curly green flames. Wondering what the cloak had turned her into, Sophie opened the door. A huge, spindly greyhound leaped off the hillside between the grinding black blocks of the castle and landed in the middle of the room. Sophie dropped the cloak and backed away hurriedly. She had always been nervous of dogs, and greyhounds are not reassuring to look at. This one put itself between her and the door and stared at her. Sophie looked longingly at the wheeling rocks and heather outside, and wondered whether it would do any good to yell for Howl. The dog bent its already bent back, and somehow hoisted itself onto its lean hind legs. That made it almost as tall as Sophie. It held its front legs stiffly out, and heaved upward again. Then, as Sophie had her mouth open to yell to Howl, the creature put out what was obviously an enormous effort, and surged upward into the shape of a man in a crumpled brown suit. He had gingerish hair and a pale, unhappy face. "Came from upper folding," panted this dog-man. "Love Letty. Letty sent me. Letty crying and very unhappy. Sent me to you. Told me to stay." He began to double up and shrink before he had finished speaking. He gave a dog howl of despair and annoyance. "Don't tell Wizard," he whined, and dwindled away inside reddish curly hair into a dog again. A different dog. This time he seemed to be a red setter. The red setter waved its fringed tail and stared earnestly at Sophie from melting, miserable eyes. "Oh, dear," said Sophie as she shut the door. "You do have troubles, my friend. You were that collie dog, weren't you? Now I see what Mrs. Fairfax was talking about.
That witch wants slaying, she really does. But why has Letty sent you here? If you don't want me to tell Wizard Howl." The dog growled faintly at the name, but it also wagged its tail and stared appealingly. "All right. I won't tell him," Sophie promised. The dog seemed reassured. He trotted to the hearth, where he gave Calcifer a somewhat wary look and lay down beside the fender in a skinny red bundle. "Calcifer, what do you think?" Sophie said. "This dog is a bespelled human," Calcifer said unnecessarily. "I know, but can you take the spell off him?" Sophie asked. She supposed Letty must have heard, like so many people, that Howl had a witch working for him now, and it seemed rather important to turn the dog into a man again and send him back to upper folding before Howl got out of bed and found him there. "No, I'd need to be linked with Howl for that," Calcifer said. "Then I'll try it myself," Sophie said. Poor Letty, breaking her heart for Howl and her only other lover a dog most of the time. Sophie laid her hand on the dog's soft rounded head. "Turn back into the man you should be," she said. She said it quite often, but its only effect seemed to be to send the dog deeply to sleep. It snored and twitched against Sophie's legs. Meanwhile, a certain amount of moaning and groaning was coming from upstairs. Sophie kept muttering to the dog and ignored it. A loud, hollow coughing followed, dying away into more moaning. Sophie ignored that too. Crashing sneezes followed the coughing, each one rattling the window and all the doors. Sophie found those harder to ignore, but she managed. "Poot, poot," went a blown nose, like a bassoon in a tunnel. The coughing started again, mingled with moans. Sneezes mixed with the moans and the coughs, and the sounds rose to a crescendo in which Howl seemed to be managing to cough, groan, blow his nose, sneeze, and wail gently all at the same time. The doors rattled, the beams in the ceiling shook, and one of Calcifer's logs rolled off onto the hearth. All right, I get the message," Sophie said, dumping the log back into the grate. "It'll be green slime next. Calcifer, make sure that dog stays where it is." And she climbed the stairs, muttering loudly, "Really, these wizards, you'd think no one had ever had a cold before." "Well, what is it?" she asked, hobbling through the bedroom door onto the filthy carpet. "I'm dying of boredom," Howl said pathetically. "Or maybe just dying." He was lying propped on dirty grey pillows, looking quite poorly, with what might have been a patchwork coverlet over him, except that it was all one colour with dust. The spiders he seemed to like so much were spinning busily in the canopy above him. Sophie felt his forehead. "You do have a bit of a fever," she admitted. "I'm delirious," said Howl. "Spots are crawling before my eyes." "Those are spiders," said Sophie. "Why can't you cure yourself with a spell?" "Because there is no cure for a cold," Howl said dolefully. "Things are going round and round in my head. Or maybe my head is going round and round in things. I keep thinking of the terms of the witch's curse. I hadn't realized she could lay me bare like that. It's a bad thing to be laid bare, even though the things that are true so far are all my own doing. I keep waiting for the rest to happen." Sophie thought back to the puzzling verse. "What things? Tell me where all past years are?" "Oh, I know that," said Howl. "My own or anyone else's. They're all there, just where they always were. I could go and play bad fairy at my own christening if I wanted. Maybe I did, and that's my trouble. No, there are only 3 things I'm waiting for. The mermaids, the mandrake root, and the wine to advance an honest mind. And whether I get white hairs, I suppose. Only I'm not going to take the spell off to see. There's only about 3 weeks left for them to come true in, and the witch gets me as soon as they do. But the rugby club reunion is Midsummer Eve, so I shall get to that at least. The rest had all happened long ago." You mean the falling star and never being able to find a woman true and fair, said Sophie. I'm not surprised the way you go on. Mrs. Pentstemon told me you were going to the bad. She was right, wasn't she? I must go to her funeral if it kills me, Howl said sadly. Mrs. Pentstemon always thought far too well of me. I blinded her with my charm. Water ran out of his eyes. Sophie had no idea if he was really crying or whether it was simply his cold, but she noticed he was slithering out again. I was talking about the way you keep dropping ladies as soon as you've made them love you, she said. Why do you do it? Howl pointed a shaky hand up toward the canopy of his bed. That's why I love spiders. If at first you don't succeed, try again. I keep trying, he said with great sadness, but I brought it on myself by making a bargain some years ago, and I know I shall never be able to love anyone properly now. The water running out of Howl's eyes was definitely tears now. Sophie was concerned. Now, you mustn't cry. There was a pattering outside. Sophie looked round to see the dog-man oozing himself past the door in a neat half-circle. She reached out and caught a handful of his red coat, thinking he was certainly coming to bite Howl. But all the dog did was to lean against her legs, so that she had to stagger back to the peeling wall. "What's this?" said Howl. "My new dog," Sophie said, hanging on to its curly hair. Now she was against the wall. She could see out of the bedroom window. It ought to have looked out on the yard, but instead it showed a view of a neat square garden with a child's metal swing in the middle. The setting sun was firing raindrops hanging on the swing to blue and red. As Sophie stood and stared, Howl's niece Mary came running across the wet grass. Howl's sister Megan followed Mary. She was evidently shouting that Mary should not sit on the wet swing, but no sound seemed to come through. "Is that the place called Wales?" Sophie asked. Howl laughed and pounded on the coverlet. Dust climbed like smoke. "Bother that dog," he croaked. "I had a bet on with myself that I could keep you from snooping out of the window all the time you were in here." "Did you now?" said Sophie, and she let go of the dog, hoping he would bite Howl hard. But the dog went on leaning on her, shoving her toward the door now. "So all that song and dance was just a game, was it?" she said. "I might have known." Howl lay back on his grey pillows, looking wronged and injured. "Sometimes," he said reproachfully, "you sound just like Megan." "Sometimes," Sophie answered, shooing the dog out of the room in front of her, "I understand how Megan got the way she is." And she shut the door on the spiders, the dust, and the garden with a loud bang.